Well, let's follow up on today's debate in the House about Canada's ISIS mission with three members of Parliament. From the foyer of the Commons this evening, I'm joined by John McKay, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence. James Bezan is the Defence Critic for the official opposition Conservatives. And Randall Garrison is the Defence Critic for the NDP. Good to see you all, gentlemen.
Good to be here.
Mr. Bezan, if I can, I'll start with you since it was your motion the House is debating today. We heard the Prime Minister say in question period today that not only are Canada's allies supportive of the position his government is taking on the air combat mission against ISIS, but as evidence of that, he says he's going to be the first Prime Minister treated to a state dinner at the White House in 20 years. What's your response to that?
Well, you know, it's nice that he's going to be able to go to the White House and sip champagne and eat caviar, but there's real serious questions that we're dealing with right now, and that is how can Canada best engage in the battle against ISIS? And it is a combat battle. We know that the leaders from the UK, from the United States, from France, as others are calling for a more robust military intervention. The Secretary of Defense in the United States, Carter, has been calling around asking 40 countries to bring in more resources to take on the fight against ISIS. And meanwhile, we have a government here that would rather retreat than fight and remove our CF-18s from the battle. We still don't have a plan coming from the government as to exactly what they want to do. So we expect the Prime Minister to actually come forward, present a plan, and allow Parliament to debate it, as is the custom around here when we're dealing with military deployments.
Okay, let me move to Mr. McKay. We'll pick up on some of those points you've raised as well. Mr. McKay, so what was the Prime Minister trying to say with those comments?
Well, I think the one comment is that the relationship between Canada and the U.S. has been returned to some state of normalcy. It's been kind of sniping at 100 paces up until, well, for the last 10 years. So if in fact President Obama was upset with Canada's plan, then he presumably would have signaled that, and presumably would not have invited the Prime Minister.
Can I ask you this? Yeah. Can you spell out clearly for us what your government's aversion is to having Canada take part in the bombing missions, which continue, by the way, as far as we know? The Prime Minister hasn't said he's against the bombing by other coalition partners. He was given the opportunity to say that in an interview with the BBC earlier this fall, but he didn't say that. He just doesn't want Canada bombing ISIS. Yeah. Why not?
Well, as you know, we had quite a long campaign on this. It was part of our platform commitment. It was a commitment to the Canadian people, and we made the decision that we would not be participating in the bombing part.
I'm trying to get at why, because you're not against the Prime Minister isn't against bombing. He said that. What he's against is Canada bombing.
One good reason.
We think that our contribution can be more enhanced, more robust, more effective if, in fact, we withdraw from that part of the mission and participate in training and or other activities as are negotiated between the allies. And so, as I say, he's met with President Obama. He seems to be fine with it. He's met with Prime Minister Cameron. He seems to be fine with it. He's met with President Hollande. He seems to be fine with it. So all of our major allies seem to be on side with our notion that we're going to reprofile the mission. And I don't know why today we're having this debate, which is in effect a motion put forward by the Conservative Party for us to break a commitment to the Canadian people.
Let me move to Mr. Garrison. The conversation, Mr. Garrison, between the other two parties is about whether to bomb or not. What's the NDP position on this?
Well, we've always been very consistent that we don't think bombing is an effective way to defeat ISIS. In fact, it feeds right into their ideology, which calls for a great confrontation with the West that will lead to the end of all time. So what we think is that Canada's missing an opportunity to provide leadership on the world level to do the things that would be really effective against ISIS, and that's cutting off their money, cutting off their oil sales, cutting off the arms flows, and cutting off the flow of foreign fighters. These are the things that are called for in the UN Security Council resolutions, and this is the kind of action we used to see from Canada, where Canada would step forward as a middle power and a representative of the consensus in the world community to do what's most effective in opposing this threat.
But is there really a role for Canada to do that now? If one part of the coalition is about bombing, the other part is about beefing up training, how do you become the country that's saying, look, we got to do these other things that don't involve combat or training?
Well, I don't think that these things necessarily avoid combat. What they do is to do things that are more effective. And the bombing we've been doing for months, and we spent millions of dollars on it, and it hasn't been effective. So the UN Security Council has called for these other things that get at the heart of what makes ISIS able to control its territory and therefore able to command the loyalty of supporters. You know, it can't be a caliphate without territory and without government powers. And if you take away its ability to do that, you take away its reason for existence.
Mr. Bezan, we know Canada is delivering about 2% of the airstrikes against ISIS as part of the coalition. What's lost for Canada by abandoning that role if, as the government says, it's going to be focusing more resources on more robust training of local fighters? What do we lose if we give up 2% of the bombing?
Well, if you're going to, 2%, if you're talking about greenhouse gases, is too much, and if you're talking about bombing, it's too little. So, that doesn't make any sense. 2% is significant, and I think that when you look at the great job that
is the assumption that somebody else won't pick up the 2%?
Oh, look, actually, the bombing rates have increased because of the extra resources that have been attributed by other coalition partners, and I know that Canada can do more as well. But that doesn't mean that we don't back away from the combat mission. Canada's always been at the front lines. Whether you talk about Juno Beach, Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, the Medic Pocket, or the Panjwai District and the Battle of Panjwai, Canada has always been at the front. The Canadian armed forces are always very proud.
But I want to understand the position clearly. That your position is the government, the Conservative Party's position is if there's combat, we need to be part of it, as opposed to stepping back from combat to do more robust training.
Yeah, well, we support more robust training as well. We support more humanitarian aid. We support the political and diplomatic solutions that have to be negotiated with various partners, including the Syrians. Okay. But ultimately, we're not going to be able to have a diplomatic solution with ISIS. They're a bunch of terrorists. They will not stop their genocide or trying to form the caliphate. And the UN security resolution that Randall referred to actually does mention that we need to make sure they can establish territory. So all partners in the UN are called to action here, and Canada has been part of the combat mission. We should stay as part of the combat mission, because when you step back from the front line, you're going to be put on the sideline, and then you're not going to be taken seriously on the international stage.
Mr. McKay, what's your answer to that?
Well, we seem to be being taken very seriously on the international stage if in fact Mr. Trudeau's conversations with the aforementioned prime ministers of Great Britain and presidents of the United States and Europe are to be believed. So we are not proposing the stepping back from the combat mission. We are proposing the reprofiling of what our contribution might be. And our contribution needs to be more effective. As Randall rightly says, we've been bombing for months here. And the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and over again and expecting different.
But you're not against bombing.
We're not. We'll leave that to. Hang on, James.
How do you say you're not against bombing and then call it insanity?
Well, we'll leave that to the other folks, to the other allies. We think that it's useful for us to actually get in and try to do something else. It's a tactical change, and James mentions Vimy. I just mentioned in that historical reference that it was the Canadians that changed the tactics of World War I and ultimately brought a resolution to it. So I think we have a long and historical military tradition, which shows that when we put our shoulders to the wheel, we're still putting our shoulders to the wheel.
Let me bring Mr. Garrison here. Mr. Garrison, go ahead. I know you want to jump in there.
Well, I'm very concerned about the lack of any specifics on this training mission. As somebody who worked in Afghanistan myself, in training of security forces, we know it takes a long time to have an impact. And I'm a bit worried we're repeating the same kind of pattern here in Afghanistan. When we found that the direct combat roles didn't work, then Canada got involved in training. And now we had, just yesterday, the Taliban back seizing control of the airport in Kandahar and killing more than 50 people. So what we have to do is understand the nature of who we're up against and do the things that are most effective in combating them, and I'm afraid we're repeating a failed pattern here.
Mr. McKay, and then Mr. Bezan will come back to you. I just want to get Mr. McKay on the issue of when might we see some of the details of what this plan looks like.
Well, I think the plan will evolve sooner rather than later. I think that we are in a mature state of discussions with our various allies. I think that there are going to be some really intense conversations in the next few weeks, and so beyond that, I can't actually say as to when we would have, quote unquote, a plan going forward. I think, however, Canadians will feel fairly confident that this change in tactics will result in some resolution or reduction in the conflict.
Okay, Mr. Bezan, I think we're almost close to the end here, but get your thoughts on how quickly Canadians need to see this plan. Well, and the idea is that it's going to be discussed among allies before it's rolled out here to see exactly how Canada can help in this beefed up role.
Well, it's not going to be a beefed up role because they're taking us away from combat.
You couldn't see it, but my hands were in quotation marks.
But anyway,
because that's how the government describes it, as a beefed up role.
Okay, well, let me just say this, that one of the reasons we were up for this motion was that Parliament has pronounced itself on past military missions. It's a tradition that we have in this place, and that's why this motion came forward today, because I fear that the Liberal government is going to bring forward these changes during the holiday season when they hope nobody's looking.
Okay, quickly, Mr. Garrison, to you, Canadians need to see this in the full light of day here when parliamentarians are back on the job, and so nothing during the Christmas break?
Well, I was glad to see that we're having a debate in the House, and I do thank the Conservatives for bringing forward the motion today. It's very important that Canadians be involved at every step of the way in this direction. The training actually presents a real risk that if we have a large training mission, that we might inevitably get involved in boots on the ground in trying to defend our trainers. So this is a very serious question about safety and security for the people we're going to put in the field. I know they're ready to go. The Canadian forces are all ready to do their duty and do their job, but Canadians want to have a say in how this rolls out.
All right, gentlemen, we'll continue to follow the story. I do appreciate your time tonight. All the best over the break.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas.